guys, so today we are going to talk about a chapel in London that had a very gruesome history. And I stumbled upon this story while I was listening to a new podcast. Now, I will tell you, I've only listened to one episode, but so far I'm loving it. If you check out My Victorian Nightmare, loved it. It was fantastic. Tell me what you think about that. But anyway, the chapel we're talking about today is called Enon Chapel. So this chapel was down on St. Clement's Lane, close to the Strand in London. It was built in either 1822 or 1823, reports differ. And it was not a huge place. It only had 2 stories. The top story was for parishioners, the bottom story was like a basement, and then the sewer flowed underneath that. So it was run by a minister named W. House, and apparently he was quite the unscrupulous guy. So at the time, it was not uncommon to have your family members buried in a churchyard or even under the church. People were afraid of body snatchers because grave diggers would come and dig up bodies and sell them to doctors so that the doctors could use them for research, which isn't super weird because we still use corpses for research today. It's just legal. Back then, it wasn't made legal until like 1832. So the doctors had to resort to other means to get their bodies. Anyway, this was not uncommon practice. But what was uncommon about this particular chapel is how many bodies were buried there and under what circumstances. So there are a bunch of articles in newspapers from London. Most of them were written by a surgeon named George Alfred Walker, and he was a lead proponent of not burying bodies where you live. And he went all over London, studied all the cemeteries, the graveyards, etc., did a huge scientific study on it, visited people who were sick in the neighborhoods, etc., and then wrote these articles to the newspaper and reports to different commissions trying to get people to not bury people where they lived. A lot of the things I'm going to tell you today come from his reports. So what I've read is that under this church, there was a 40-foot by 50-foot pit. It was situated over a sewer. Above this pit was the actual church where the parishioners would come to Sunday school, they'd attend services, etc. Unfortunately, the only thing separating these 2 places was a very just wooden floor. Like, there was no plaster underneath of it. There was not, double wood. It was wooden planks. And if you looked through the wooden planks, you could actually see the bodies below you. So we have lots of reports from parishioners of flies all over the church. People said that when they got home from church, there'd be these, they called them body bugs, still like in their hair and their clothes and their hats. People were fainting in the church, passing out, getting sick after attending the church. There were little kids that were supposed to be there for like 6 hours on Sundays attending Sunday school. They would come home sick and smelling. People said that they'd come home with this weird, strange taste in their mouth. And even in the houses around this chapel, there were rats everywhere, flies everywhere. And apparently if you had any meat, it would get rotten super quickly because of all the smells and the decomposition happening around it. So what we come to find out is that W. House was taking bodies and burying them in the church. He was doing it for super cheap. I think I read somewhere that usually it was like 117 pounds to bury a body. He was doing it for like 15. And he was taking in an excessive amount of bodies to the point that he filled up the pit and then began to take the bodies out of the caskets, chop up the caskets, and sell the caskets as firewood. Walker, the doctor we talked about, he actually tracked down where some of the firewood went and found that some of the people that bought the firewood and were burning it actually got sick from the vapors, supposedly. In 1834, after some complaints, the Commission of Sewers did an investigation under this chapel, and they found all the bodies, but they didn't do anything about the bodies. All they did, they built a vault over the top of the sewer so that the bodies could no longer fall into the sewer and get into the sewer system. In 1842, Mr. House passed away, and when he passed away, they discovered that he had apparently been putting bodies into the river because he ran out of space. He'd been dousing the bodies in the basement with quicklime to make them disintegrate quicker, and they even found bodies buried under his kitchen. The church was bought by a different group in 1844, and this is where the dancing bit comes in. Apparently, this group made basically a saloon over the top, and it had 2 different rooms. One was for coffee, one was for smoking, and rich people, all sorts of people, would rent this place out and have dances up there and balls, and they actually advertised it as dancing on the dead. And in the advertisement, they made sure to say that you must be wearing shoes and stockings because bleh. Finally, in 1848, our doctor, George Alfred Walker, ended up buying this property, and he did the right thing. At his own expense, he had all of these bodies removed and moved to Norwood Cemetery. In one article I read, it said that the bodies were buried in a 20-foot by 9-foot plot that was just a pit. He buried them all together, but his plan was to bury them with some dignity and then place a memorial over the top of this. So I did try to see if this memorial still existed, but I found that in the 1980s, the Lambeth Council actually bought this cemetery and illegally destroyed a bunch of the graves and memorials, trying to make room for new bodies and graves. So I don't think that exists anymore. If you know differently, let me know. So in all, when it was said and done and the bodies were unburied and moved to a more appropriate place, the estimate was that 12,000 bodies were buried under Enon Chapel and just allowed to decompose there in the middle of the city, making everyone sick. If you're curious about the chapel nowadays, well, nowadays it is actually gone, and over the top was built the London School of Economics. Now, this school, I looked it up, it's supposedly a very haunted place, which, knowing about the Enon Chapel, does not surprise me. But apparently it's also located very close to Fleet Street, which, you know, Sweetie Todd. But it's also very close to Lincoln's Inn Fields, which is where executions have taken place for a very long time. So no surprise that that school is supposed to be very, very haunted. All right, see you next time.